Stauffenberg, when he makes his assassination attempt in 1944, he's not on our side. We have to remember that, right? He wants Germany to disavow Nazism, but he still wants Germany to be great. And he wants to restore something of the old Germany that he saw himself as the embodiment of, which was aristocratic, which was, old school. It wasn't democratic. He wasn't a Democrat, right? So he's a very mixed character in that respect, and I think very often where particularly modern Germany and Germany of, the last sort of 40 years, where it has, in many ways, in a very exemplary fashion, it has engaged with its own history because it needs to have someone to hold up as a positive. It holds up Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg would probably be rather horrified by the democratic Germany. When it goes off, 3 people are killed the same afternoon, essentially that moment. And they're all on that side of the table. Okay? The 4th person dies about 3 months later. But 3 people are killed that afternoon, and they're all on that side of the table. So that shows you that actually 2 things. The moving of the bag was crucial, was decisive, and also the fact that the bomb was half the bomb it should have been is decisive. If you change either of those, or ideally both of those, again, Hitler is probably toast.
Hello and welcome to the 2-part special on the 80th anniversary of the assassination attempt against Adolf Hitler on the 20th of July 1944 by Claus von Stauffenberg. In today's first part, Roger Moorhouse joins to discuss the major plots to kill Hitler prior to 44, as well as the July plot itself. And then in part 2, out on Saturday, Roger returns with Tim Hewitt to discuss the film Valkyrie, starring Tom Cruise. Today, we talk about the quiet German patriot who tried to kill Hitler before many senior German officers considered it, as well as the British plot, and even discuss a bizarre American idea. Don't forget to listen to part 2, which drops this Saturday on the 20th, and so on the anniversary of the attempt. Ignore references to tomorrow in our discussion today. And I should mention this recording took place prior to the attempt on former President Trump. Plenty more great history to come, including Europe in the aftermath of World War II, the Napoleonic era through the eyes of Izabela Czartoryski, a self-taught Polish aristocrat, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, plus much, much more. So please do subscribe or follow, and if you can leave a gentle review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, I'd be hugely grateful. But until then, I'll hand you over to Roger Moorhouse and me discussing killing Hitler. Roger, welcome back to the pod. It's great to have you on. Thank you for joining me.
Hello, Ollie. Good to be back.
And you a regular appearances on here.
I know, like
yes.
A bad smell.
Thank you, Roger, though. And so this is the first in actually 2 episodes coming out for listeners to coincide with the July plot in 1944 against Adolf Hitler.
80th anniversary thereof.
Indeed. I guess I'd say orchestrated by Colonel von Stauffenberg. You'll probably pick me up on whether that was quite true. But that's the real reason for us discussing. Now, today's episode, listeners, is Roger wrote his first book that he wrote all by himself was Killing Hitler, the Third Reich and the Plots to Kill the Führer. And this is a book that I bought many years ago. And it is our book club book because of the anniversary and because of the subject matter. Of course, who doesn't want to talk about trying to kill Adolf Hitler? And so it deals with all the various plots. But on today's chat, we're going to talk about a few of the sort of more interesting ones, I think. There were quite a few. I think, was it over 10, Roger?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that often gets bandied around. There was a book came out a long time ago that talked about 42 plots on Hitler, and that book didn't even include some of the ones that I talked about. I think I talk about 15 or so, and they vary in their significance and their seriousness. But just one bloke in his bedroom kind of saying, "Oh, I really want to get rid of that that old Hitler geezer is kind of not enough. That's not going to cut it, obviously. So they all have to be sort of serious conspiracies and actually have a possibility of an effect. So you have to apply some criteria. But I think I come up with about 15 in the end. Yeah.
This was your first book, as I say. You'd co-written a book, I think, with the great Norman Davis,
Yes.
who's been on this podcast to talk about George II.
Has he really?
He has. He picked
Jolly
me up
good.
on a number of occasions for historical inaccuracies.
Yeah. He is a
I was,
stickler.
yeah. So it was like dealing with a particularly slow pupil for him.
Yeah,
Um, but he was very entertaining, but you wrote a book with him, didn't
I
you?
did. I was his previous slow pupil. Yeah, he was my professor back at university, and he must have seen something because he asked me to do some research for him, and it also went from there. So I worked on a few of his big books, Europe a History, The Isles that came out about 99, I think, and Rising 44 about the Warsaw Rising. So I worked on a few of his books going forward, and one of those was the history of Wrocław, which is what used to be the German Breslau, capital city of the province of Silesia, which is now southwestern Poland, used to be southeastern Germany. And it has this sort of rich, multicultural, multilingual history. It's very much a sort of a microcosm of Central European history as a whole. So that we called it Microcosm. And that came out in 2001. So that was co-authored. And I sort of filled the gap in Norman's palette of talents, but certainly linguistically, because I have German and he doesn't speak German. He speaks quite a few languages, but he doesn't speak German. So I sort of filled that side of the job. And Killing Hitler was my first solo book. Came out in 2006, and it was funny. I just as a brief moment. It's one of those a moment where the idea sort of comes to you in a flash. And it's strange. I can remember it quite clearly. I was in the shower, and I was thinking about Stauffenberg as you do. I'm sure you're the same, Ollie. You think about Stauffenberg when you're in the shower. And I sort of thought, well, there was that other guy. There was that Georg Elser who you just mentioned earlier on, and you know, there was a sort of flash. And I thought, oh, actually, there were quite a few. There were quite a few of these plots, and I thought, I wonder if anyone's actually put all that together. Because my logic was, everyone knew about Stauffenberg, and the others are kind of to a degree kind of hidden behind him in the historiography because he looms so large, because his story is so dramatic. He was the one that got closest to actually achieving his aim, and he was good looking and aristocratic and all those things. So he garners all the attention for understandable reasons, but in the process, everyone else gets forgotten, and that's certainly the case with someone like Georg Elser. So I sort of was pondering all of that under the shower, and then when I got out and sort of had a look at
You
what was
dried
available,
yourself off, did you?
dried
And
myself
got
off
out,
first. Yeah, I did manage to drive
got
myself off.
dressed.
Yeah, did all that. Yeah, um, and I sort of started looking into it, and there wasn't a book that had done what I wanted to do. So I thought, okay, there's a gap, and what I do like to. It sounds very pompous, but I do like to sort of try and contribute something rather than just rehash what someone else has done. So I thought that's actually that has a historiographical value to try and tell those stories. So that's what I did. It was about the many and various plots against Hitler.
Well, I wanted to ask you in the first place, really, do we and did the plotters, and I guess this becomes more relevant the more power Hitler gains, do they fixate too much on Hitler, i.e., we have to kill Hitler and then everything will be okay? Because surely he would simply have been replaced by a fellow ideologue, someone like
Mm,
Heinrich Himmler, or
mm.
had Heydrich not been killed, someone
Heydrich,
of
yeah.
someone. What I mean is someone who was good. I mean, good as in effective.
Yeah. I think you're broadly right there. I mean, what's interesting about the Stauffenberg plot that comes to fruition in the summer of 44 is that they don't fall into that trap for various reasons. I mean, it is quite a reasonably wide-ranging conspiracy, based in the military, German military, but with political angles and political participants to it. So they understand partly because of who they are, because it's fundamentally conservative, right? They are coming at him from a conservative standpoint. And by that time in the war, if you kill Hitler, and you can expect that the fronts will collapse at that point, and particularly the Eastern Front, which is already, this is the summer of the collapse of Army Group Center and so on. The Soviets are making huge gains in the East. You could reasonably expect that the Eastern Front would probably collapse. And that was the last thing they wanted, particularly the military men, right? If you kill Hitler and then that just brings about a Bolshevik takeover of Germany, that's not a win as far as they were concerned. So this was the problem they faced. Fundamental problem was that it wasn't enough just to kill Hitler. You had to kill Hitler and then take power as well. So you had to have both an assassination plot and simultaneously a sort of palace coup, which is what the wider Valkyrie plot is. So they realized that very clearly, that it wasn't enough just to kill Hitler. But the earlier plots, I think it's fair to say, and that goes all the way back, to his days as a sort of rabble rouser and agitator in the 1920s. There were a few people sort of half-heartedly that tried to target him then, and even up to someone like Georg Elser in 1939, and even the Abwehr plotters in 38 and 39. There's such a focus put and an emphasis put on Hitler's charisma, his dark charisma, to use that phrase, his dark charisma, and his own personality, the power of his own personality within Nazism, that the assumption is if you kill Hitler, then the thing will collapse, right? Obviously, by 44, the strategic thinking, or put it this way, by 44, the thinking has got more strategic than that. But in the early phase, yeah. So everyone else just thinks, well, you get rid of Hitler, the whole edifice collapses anyway. And Nazism is Hitler, and Hitler is Nazism. But I think you're right, and your question is fundamentally right, that there were some pretty capable, certainly politicians. You look at someone like Goebbels, who we tend to dismiss, I think, particularly in English language historiography. We dismiss him as the sort of poison dwarf and the propagandist and so on, and sort of habitual liar and blah, blah, blah. He was a tremendously intelligent and capable man. I mean, evil, absolutely, but he was tremendously clever man. Now, whether he had the ability to sort of step into Hitler's shoes as that, quasi, godlike leader of the movement is another question. But he was certainly, he had the balls to do it and the brain to do it, if you like. So I take your point, and I think it's a fair point that they were focusing probably too much on Hitler personally.
Which I suppose is because the army have to pledge allegiance to Hitler himself. It's actually, his name is the name that they say out loud when pledging their oath.
Yeah, which is a real thing, and we spoke about that when
tomorrow we're going to be
yeah.
speaking about that.
Yes. Oh yes, tomorrow. Sorry, tomorrow we're going to be speaking about about the significance of the oath of allegiance, because it is a significant thing as an obstacle to the military resistance. And again, that's why the significance of Hitler being dead was considered so important, because it broke that spell. You can't maintain your allegiance to someone who's dead. So that was an important part of the whole process. Yeah.
Well, so we'll start with the first, I think, serious plot, and you can pick me up if I'm wrong on that. But is Georg Elser in 1939? So Hitler's been in power 6 years. Elser is the first genuine plot to murder Hitler that actually comes vaguely close, or fairly close.
Yeah, comes to there was there's a weird guy called Maurice Bavor, who's a Swiss theology student, who there's a chapter on him in the book, which is an interesting case. He kind of tried to target Hitler in 38, in autumn of 38, and didn't really get close. He did sort of travel to Germany with a gun in his pocket and all this sort of thing. So it's kind of an interesting story. He did pay for his plotting with his life, because he was executed. He was caught and executed. So it wasn't like, it wasn't like he was just imagining it. He really did try and do it. But yeah, Elsa's the first one that really puts Hitler's life under genuine threat, put it that way. And Elsa's an interesting case because on a number of levels. The first one is that he was, the Nazis themselves viewed him as, absolutely, the sort of person. He was from southwest Germany, from Schwaben, from the area around Stuttgart. He was a craftsman. He was a bit of a lone wolf. He was a bit of a loner. He was the sort of person that, across the country had formed very much the backbone of everything Nazism was, right? He was an ordinary German who, felt a bit crushed by the times, by, the economic crisis and all this sort of thing. And in their droves, people like that had gone over to the Nazis and said, yes, we'll support you because you're offering something different. Elsa had gone the other way and had, taken against Hitler, I think in a very sort of visceral, personal way. He saw Hitler as the enemy, not only of himself, but of Germany and of humanity. And crucially, he saw in Hitler a threat to peace. So he saw this, the slide to war that it was happening already in 1938 with the Czech crisis. And that's when he begins his sort of serious plotting. So rather than sitting grumbling, he actually starts to plot from 1938. And he sees his opportunity in the commemorations of the beer hall putsch in Munich, which of course happened in 1923. And the Nazis commemorated that every year with this grand ceremonial and all sorts of events and speeches and so on, because that was really the sort of that's a sort of pseudo religious kind of martyrology of Nazism was right there in Munich. That's where 16 people were killed, where Hitler narrowly escaped death and so on. So it really took center stage in sort of Nazi ceremonial, and they commemorated very lavishly every year. So Elsa thought, okay, that's the place I can hit him. That's where I know he's going to be every year, right? So he says to himself in 1938, November 38, watching those rallies, he says, I know where he's going to be next year, this time next year. And he was right. And it was this beer hall where the putsch had started in 1923 called the Bürgerbräukeller. And Hitler always gave a speech there that kicked off the whole weekend of commemorations, right? So he sort of, has essentially a year to plan, and it's very thorough. He sort of collects explosives. He gets a job in a quarry to get hold of explosives, which he then systematically steals from the storeroom. He builds, because he's a tremendous craftsman. He had worked in a clockworkers, and very accustomed to building stuff and creating stuff with his own hands. Brilliant craftsman. Built both a timing mechanism and a detonator to go with his bomb, and then turns up in Munich and goes to this beer hall, armed with a sort of a case of all of this stuff that he's been preparing for the previous, whatever it is, 9 or 10 months. Turns up in Munich, goes to the beer hall every night for 6 weeks, has a beer and sits in the corner very quietly, which is kind of what he did. Didn't really speak to anyone. And then when they're about to close, he sneaks upstairs to the toilet and he locks himself in the loo, right? And then once everything's quiet, he comes out again and starts working. And he fashions this cavity in the pillar where he knows, because he watched the previous year's events. He knows that's where Hitler's lectern is going to be for the speech. There's a big balcony above, which if you blow that pillar, the balcony will come down pretty much on the lectern. So, he's really thought it out, and he spends basically, a month or so, pretty much every night, going in there after closing time and hollowing out this cavity in the brick pillar. It was, lined with cork, so it wouldn't kind of, the ticking of the bomb mechanism or the timer mechanism wouldn't be heard outside and things like that. So he really thought of everything, and a sort of flush fitting door so no one would even see that it had been tampered with. I mean, brilliant, absolutely brilliant job. And again, the timing mechanism was made to run for 144 hours, so that he could be out of, even not even out of town, but out of Germany. That was the plan when the bomb went off. Hitler turns up and to give the speech, and there are some issues. The primary issue being that the weather's turned. This is November of 39 now. The weather's turned, and he'd normally fly back to Berlin. He's got to be back in Berlin for meetings and various things. So he would normally fly, but there's fog. So he says, well, I'm going to have to get the train, which means he's going to cut his speech short. So he turns up, gives his speech at the Bürgerbräukeller as usual. There's lots of rah-rah and banging of the tables and all of that, as you can imagine. Lots of Sieg Heiling. And then Hitler departs and goes to the railway station to get his train. And 13 minutes after he leaves the building, Elsa's bomb duly goes off. blows out that pillar as he'd planned it to, brings down not only the gallery above, but also the roof of the whole building. It kills 8 people in the room. And this was already, this was full of people basically filing out, and the bar staff were clearing the room. So it wasn't even as packed as it had been 13 minutes before. So I think there's absolutely no doubt that had those plans not been changed and Hitler was standing at that podium at the lectern when the bomb went off, that he would have been killed. There's no question because
So that
of
fog,
the force of it. Yeah, it's force majeure,
and we're November 39. So
November 39, exactly. So I mean, it's a wonderful story, and it really was, since the book, and it's not really because of the book, but maybe to a small extent, but the story has become much better known. There was a German film was made of it called 13 Minutes, which came out probably 10 years ago, which is pretty good, actually.
one could argue this is a more important plot because of the what if. You
Yeah,
haven't had
yeah,
another five
absolutely.
years of war.
Absolutely right. And that's a key thing, I think, because if you apply the same what if to Stauffenberg in 44, if Stauffenberg had killed Hitler, yeah, okay, they might have been able to take power. That wider coup that I was talking about, that's still an open question, but it wouldn't really have changed the sort of the wider strategic constellation. Germany would have had to somehow come to terms with the Allied powers, which probably meant submission, and it probably meant occupation, and you still got tens of millions of dead because it's all happened by then. November 1939 is very different. The war has, of course, just started, so Poland's already got it in the neck. It's already been thrown under the bus, as it were, but the wider war hasn't really got going. We're still in the phase of the phony war, so potentially, if you remove Hitler at that point, the possibilities for genuine change, for a genuinely different path, are much richer than they were in 1944. So the what if is hugely significant.
And I suppose it's too difficult to know who would replace Hitler as a figurehead, as Führer.
Nominally, it would probably have been Goering, because Goering was the deputy chancellor. So it's a bit like Biden and Harris now, right? If Biden steps down, it's going to be Kamala Harris by default. So by
Right.
default, it would have been Goering, unless there were some machinations or some other deal done. So by default, it would have been Goering, who was then, to be fair to him, calling Goering a moderate sounds ridiculous, but he was a more moderate voice, admittedly in a sort of cabinet of lunatics, but he was a more moderate voice than some others, so shall we say, and more conservative voice. So again, that the what if is really sort of is quite pregnant with possibilities in 39 in the way that it isn't in 1944.
Okay, so Elsa is found though. He doesn't get out of Germany, does he?
No, yeah, this is Elsa's tragedy. I mean, as I said, he set his timer 144 hours, hot-footed it to the Swiss border, and he had recce'd the area, but he'd recce'd it before the 1st of September 1939. So back when frontier posts were a little bit less rigorously patrolled and so on. So he turns up again in November 39, expecting to be able to sort of walk across the frontier. And bizarrely, he had in his pockets like a postcard of the Bürgerbräukeller, some fuse wire, a pair of pliers. It's almost like he'd sort of packed his own pockets with things that could show to whoever, Swiss press or the Swiss police, so that he could say, that thing that's just happened in Munich, and then empty his pockets and say, ta-da, that was me, right? It's almost as though that's what he was doing. But unfortunately for him, because of those heightened security precautions of the war, he's picked up by the wrong group of policemen. He's picked up by the German police, and they say, "What are you doing?" He's loitering by the frontier. What are you doing? Oh, I'm just waiting for someone. They said, "Oh, all right, come in here. We'll have a chat," sort of thing. And then at that point, it's game over. Empties his pockets. He basically the contents of his pockets confessed to the wrong group of policemen. Of course, the Germans refused to believe that he possibly acted alone. There's no way, right? Because they've just gone to war, for one thing. And then secondarily, when they realize the complexity, because they find what's left of, like the detonator and the timer mechanism and so on. And they realize this was a sort of serious thing. And they just can't possibly believe that he acted alone. So he has to be a British agent, right? And he's beaten up. And even Himmler apparently, puts the boot into him in interrogation to,
Really?
yeah, to try and get him to confess that he was a British agent.
Himmler dirties his hands
Yeah, he does. He puts the
or his
boot
feet.
into
Yeah.
to Georg Elser. Yeah, yeah. And Elser always says, no, I'd act alone because, Hitler's a threat to, the world and blah, blah, blah. And eventually they say to him, okay, like this is the clincher. They say to him, well, okay, if you acted alone, if we give you a workshop and some tools, you can make make the detonator again, can't you? And the timing mechanism. He goes, yeah, I can. And he does. And then at that point they go, oh fuck, right, okay. So he obviously was a lone wolf. But they keep him, they keep him in prison basically from then on. He's kept in a succession of concentration camps in isolation as one of these sort of special prisoners. So he's
I
kept
was
in
always surprised they didn't kill him, execute
well,
him.
this is an interesting thing, and there's no sort of paper trail as to precisely why. Because, for example, when they caught Maurice Bavoul, the guy that I mentioned before, the Swiss theologian, he was executed. He was tried for treason and executed like the next day. Elsa is kept alive in isolation in relatively good conditions. I mean, he had like a suite of cells in Sachsenhausen where he spent most of his time, and he had a little workshop. He was given a workshop where he could kind of do stuff and make things, and he used to make zithers. You know what a zither is? It's like a little strange stringed musical instrument that you have in Central Europe. He used to make zithers. They call him the zither maker sometimes.
He sounds like a really wonderful man.
He's a really fascinating man. He really is a fascinating man, and it's one of those that of all these, you come out when I researched and wrote the book, you sort of came out of it with a real sort of sense of feeling for him. He was a good man, and he tried very hard on his own, resolutely on his own. I mean, he was a bit of a loner, let's say that, but he tried to do what he thought was the right thing. He's tremendously brave. So kept in succession concentration camps in isolation, and eventually, in as late as April 45, he was then in Dachau and was pulled out, during a British air raid on Munich. He was pulled out of his cell, taken out the back and shot in the back of the head, basically because he couldn't be allowed to survive. But why they allowed him to survive basically for 5 years, I think, and this is supposition, but I think it's informed supposition, is I think they wanted him to be the star witness at a trial of someone like Churchill, right? A war crimes trial. So he would be the star witness, and he would stand there in the dock, and he would say, or in the witness box, and they would say to him, imagine the scene, who was the man who told you to try and kill Hitler in 1939? Is he in this room? And he'd point across the dock at Churchill and say, that's the man over there, right? That's the only possible use. I'm kind of extrapolating, obviously, but that's the only possible use he could have had to them, why they kept him alive for 5 years.
Okay, well, so that's interesting because whilst Churchill wasn't directing Elsa in any way,
No.
the British did attempt to also at least contemplated assassinating Hitler during the war, didn't they?
Yeah, yeah, they did. There's a really interesting file. And this has I suppose it's had a little bit of attention, but it's still worth going through again. There's a really interesting file in the National Archives in London, and it's called Operation Foxley. That was the code name, and it was the planned assassination of Hitler by British forces. And they'd sort of wrestled with this for a long time, mainly because it sort of wasn't done right. It wasn't very sportsmanlike. It's not how the British tended to operate. And I would say still we don't really tend to operate in that way. So, for example, in 1939, the then British military attaché in Berlin, a redoubtable man by the name of Frank Noel Mason McFarlane, had suggested to his superiors in Whitehall that from his office, he had a really good view of the reviewing stand where Hitler was going to, review German forces for his birthday commemorations on the 20th of April. And he said, it's a really easy rifle shot, right? And the reply came, this was April 39, so we're not even at war at this point. The reply came back to Mason McFarlane saying, we're not yet at that stage in our diplomacy that we have to resort to assassination. And they said it wouldn't be sportsmanlike. to take him out. That was the phrase.
They actually used the word
they said
sportsmanlike.
it would be unsportsmanlike. So, and that kind of, I mean, that kind of summed up the British attitude to a large extent. That's not what we do. I mean, of course, SOE changes things. The SOE assassination, a sponsored assassination of Heydrich in 42, obviously changes that. I imagine there's a few people shouting at their phones now as they listen to me say that we don't do that sort of thing, because we did. And that's what SOE was for, to a large extent, was to do that sort of thing, wet operations.
Yeah, they were quite revolutionary within British intelligence, SOE.
It was, and it was contested as well. It was contested SOE. So a lot of traditionalists saying that's not what we do. We're British. We don't do this sort of thing. So this is a contested policy, and then there's another level of objection to this, which is that when you have the assassination of Heydrich, right, Himmler's number 2, very senior guy, in the summer of 42, what happens on the back of that is the wipeout of the Czech resistance. Right, anyone with any links to the Czech resistance taken out and shot. Literally thousands of Jews, because the Germans saw everything as a Jewish conspiracy. So if Heydrich was killed, then it had to be in part the fault of the Jewish Hydra. So literally thousands of Jews are pulled out of the concentration camps in Germany and shot. Right, so you have this huge blood toll being paid for the assassination of one man, and innocent people being killed for it. And in the corridors of power in London, people just think, this is mad. We couldn't possibly like target someone like Hitler, because what would they do? Right? It would be insane. So all of those arguments carry on all the way through. There's the unsporting argument. There's the argument that the reprisals would be horrific.
I guess reprisals would likely be meted upon British prisoners of war.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the logic, but yeah, absolutely. And then on top of that, by sort of 43, late 43, early 44, where they're actually starting to think that this might be a possibility, by that stage, Hitler's kind of endless tinkering on the military front. There's the argument that actually he's doing us a favor, right? He's helping because his constant meddling in a way that Stalin notably didn't, right? His constant meddling in military affairs is actually working to our benefit. So there are a number of reasons why this was sort of very slow to get off the ground, but it finally does in 44. And they have this Operation Foxley is a wonderful planning document, like really sort of thorough use of intelligence and gathering of intelligence. So they used to interrogate anyone that was for example, SS Leibstandarte, which was the SS division that was Hitler's bodyguard. And they used to rotate from doing bodyguard things at Hitler's headquarters to going to the front and then back again and so on. So whenever the British captured a Leibstandarte soldier, they used to, take them aside for sort of special interrogation and say, what do you know about, Hitler's headquarters and all this sort of thing? And they gathered a load of information. So, this planning file is amazing. And the plan was basically to try and target Hitler in Berchtesgaden, at the Berghof, at his house above Berchtesgaden. Using a sort of, getting an assassin in, a sniper, maybe a team of 2, most likely, to sort of hit him when he's on the terrace at Berchtesgaden, on the Berghof terrace, for example. Everyone's seen pictures of him, on the terrace.
Playing with his dog, yeah.
Playing with his dog, for example. So, ideally hit him there, or else hit him. He used to do this daily constitutional walk down to a tea house down through the woods. I have actually done the same walk. You can kind of trace the route. So yeah, he used to do that walk down the hill, and then he would get his driver to bring him back up the hill. He's too lazy to walk back up the hill. At least I walked back up the hill, Ollie. I'll tell you that for nothing.
Well done.
So, you could either hit him on the terrace, or you would hit him on his constitutional walk, or you could hit him with, like an anti-tank weapon in his car on the way back. That was the logic. So it's all really thought out. But they still have this fundamental problem of, are we actually going to do it or not? Because all of those conundrums really hadn't been squared. Okay. And by the time they sort of finally think, okay, well, maybe we will, by that stage, it's like the autumn of 44. And, it's kind of game over.
So the Stauffenberg plot's already happened by the time.
Stauffenberg's plot has already happened by that stage. So the reason why I include it, because it never goes into the operational phase. Let's make that clear. They did sort of have, supposedly they had a sniper earmarked for it. There's still controversy as to precisely who it was, but supposedly, there was, I mean, like the name is in code in the files. So we have to, but supposedly they had a guy that they thought could do it. But by the time they, so they never really squared the circle, the moral and the strategic circle of doing it in the first place. But as a planning document and as a conspiracy broadly, it's so well done and so well thought out that actually, it certainly warrants inclusion on that basis because it's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was no American involvement. They were sort of over to you Brits. You can sort of take care of this. Or they even
No,
consulted the Americans.
no, the Americans. I mean, there's Americans had weird. There was one one really weird idea. So they had one of Hitler's earliest confidants was a bloke called Putzi Hanfstengel. It's a great name. I'm sure people have heard the name of Putzi Hanfstengel. He was actually half American himself, and had been educated, I think, at Harvard, and had gone back to Germany post World War One, and had been in Munich and fallen into the same circles as Hitler. And he was actually Hitler's sort of press secretary in the very early days of the movement. And then later he fell out of favor, and he reckoned that they tried to kill him. So he basically defected and went back to America. And he then was used by the nascent CIA, the OSS, and all of that to write sort of psychological studies of Hitler because he knew him quite well. And one of the things he came up with was that Hitler was a great prude. He was very prudish. So the Americans came up with this plan, which thankfully was never actually executed, which was to drop by air large quantities of pornography around around Hitler's Bavarian residence, in the hope and expectation that on his constitutional walk to the tea house that I just mentioned, he would happen across some of this material and would probably have some sort of aneurysm, which is probably the most ridiculous assassination plot I've ever heard of. But
Well, actually, you say that, then you think of Fidel Castro's exploding cigar.
yeah,
It's like
yeah,
there's a
exactly.
pattern
There's
developing
a
here.
pattern. There's a pattern. Yeah. So yeah. So that was as far as the Americans got. Yeah.
All right. Right. Okay. Well, so Stauffenberg, we've mentioned a few times, and we talk about tomorrow the movie starring Tom Cruise. But actually, the plot itself, I mean, I've always been a bit skeptical about Stauffenberg because we're talking 1944. The war's been raging
Yeah.
5 years.
Yeah.
Many millions have died already. Is he really such a hero, particularly given that he wants to sort of come to some kind of peace agreement to secure Germany? It's not as if he doesn't want to surrender
Yeah.
completely and allow the borders to open. And actually, I think there have been many people within the upper echelons of the military and the intelligence service, like von Tresckow,
Yeah.
who are perhaps a little bit more heroic, in my view. But the Stauffenberg plot, should we look at Stauffenberg as a hero?
On one level, certainly. I think that's the right question to ask, actually. Absolutely. You're on message there, Ollie. On one level, certainly. I mean, in terms of having admittedly belatedly, but having the moral clarity to see what was going on, not only to see it, but then to say to yourself, I'm going to do something about it, is tremendously brave, physically brave and morally brave. And by moral bravery, I mean when everyone around you is saying one thing, but your principles and your convictions say the opposite, and yet you're unswayed, right? In those cases, like Henning von Tresckow as well, who you mentioned, I think there's a tremendous moral bravery in what they did. They believed that they were doing right, even though they knew it would cost them their lives, and they knew that everyone else thought differently. They were unswayed, and I think that's a tremendous thing that we should admire. Having said that, there are elements of Stauffenberg's own sort of makeup and his own history that are a bit more questionable. So he doesn't have the, if you like, the moral, to carry on with that analogy, but with the moral longevity that someone like that Tresckow had. Tresckow had been saying since the late 1930s that Hitler was a criminal, that the Nazi regime was criminal, and it had to be removed. And Stauffenberg was one of those people that, he looked on the Nazis essentially through a class lens. He was, aristocracy, again, Southwest Germany, same as Elsa. but very different world from Elsa, the one that Elsa grew up in. He was an, aristocrat, Catholic. He was very much a German nationalist, right? So he was willing to go along with the Nazis because he saw the Nazis as he would have seen it, raising Germany up from the abyss that it had found itself in after the First World War. And he saw them as, putting Germany back on top where it belonged, regaining territory that had been unjustly lost, as he would have put it. So he was willing to ride along, but he viewed the Nazis as something he would find on the bottom of his shoe, right? So his moral conversion in the end is kind of all the more interesting. It's a bit like Oscar Schindler in a way. There's a sort of narrative arc there, which makes him quite interesting, quite fascinating, because he says all the right things about, for example, about the Poles in 1939. He says horrible things about the Poles, about how, Polish society. He participates in the Polish campaign, and he says that, Polish society is very full of Jews, and these are people who are only happy under German control, under the knout, as he puts it. So he says some terrible things. He's no liberal, let's put it that way, right? He's not on our side. And even when he makes his assassination attempt in 1944, he's not on our side. We have to remember that, right? He wants Germany to disavow Nazism, but he still wants Germany to be great. And he wants to restore something of the old Germany that he saw himself as the embodiment of, which was aristocratic, which was, old school. It wasn't democratic. He wasn't a Democrat, right? So he's a very mixed character in that respect, and I think very often where particularly modern Germany and Germany of, the last sort of 40 years, where it has, in a very exemplary fashion, it has engaged with its own history, but because it needs to have someone to hold up as a positive, it holds up Stauffenberg. And Stauffenberg would probably be rather horrified by the democratic Germany, right? That's not what he wanted. He didn't want the Nazi Germany either, because in the end, he saw it as a criminal regime, but he was no Democrat, right? So
And
there's a lot there to, there's character there to get our teeth into. And the bottom line is he wasn't on our side.
was it
Just,
his disfigurement as a result of a Allied strafing raid? I think, was it a bombing that he
yeah,
lost his hand and in his eye?
yeah.
Was that sort of because he's a handsome chap? I'm this handsome aristocrat, and this bloody war's gone and made me look less handsome. And the person who's responsible for that is Hitler. Or am I making too much play of
I
his?
think, I think, well, I think it is influential in one way, certainly, is that it takes him out of the front line and it puts him initially in hospital for a long time. It wasn't thought he would survive for a while. In hospital for a long time to consider the world from his hospital bed, and what potentially, if he were to survive, what he might do about it. And then it also, because he was maimed, obviously he's no good for frontline service, so he went into essentially a desk job within the army, which meant, of course, that he was a useful candidate for this wider conspiracy, and then ultimately as the assassin. So it has the practical result, of course, that it makes all of that possible. Whether it has the sort of moral result, psychological result, that it makes him want to do something, we don't know, because we can assume there's an element of that, but we don't know. The sources don't necessarily stack up on that.
Okay, well, the plan is that he's going to blow up Hitler in the Wolf's Lair,
Mm,
and he's going to use a bomb with an acid pencil,
mm.
and the acid pencil is this piece of kit. Is it British, or where do
It's
they get it
British.
from?
Yeah, it's British. It's
But
called
how
a
do they
time.
get it? The British don't give it to them, do they?
No, it came from, there was a roundup in 1940, going back to 1940. There was a roundup of British intelligence circles, did a whole network in Holland. So when they went into Holland, occupied Holland, they quickly rounded up sort of British agents there, and they found lots of sabotage equipment, which was then sort of squirreled away by the German military intelligence, the Abwehr. And both the charges that Stauffenberg later used, one of them he used, one of them he threw away. famously, and the fuse came from those stocks, those British stocks that came via Holland. Just on one minor point, again, in case there's anyone with really niche knowledge shouting at their computer or phone, it's called a time pencil. It doesn't actually use acid, funnily enough. I think I wrote in the book that it was acid. I've learned since that it's not. It was, I think it's copper chloride or something like that. It's a different chemical that actually, but it eats through a piece of wire, sprung piece of wire, and then that once it eats through, then that detonator, fires, strikes a sort of firing pin.
And they were good. These were the most
They did
advanced.
work. They did work. I mean, considering the size, I mean, it literally is like a pencil. It's the size of a pencil, a sort of a brass hull to the thing, but essentially the size of a pencil. And you crush one end, which means that vial of the copper chloride is then allowed to get to the wire that's sprung and holds back the firing pin. So, but in terms of the size of the thing, which is what was crucial, this is why it was so important, because it was easily concealed and easily deployed. You just had to crush that glass vial, but it was quite vague in the timing. Because it depended, it was a chemical reaction. It depended on temperature as to whether, that would speed, if it's hot, it would speed it up. If it was cold, it would slow it down, for example. So what, you could broadly change or have, different thickness of wire meant that it would last longer. So, one thickness of wire was 10 minutes roughly. Another thickness of wire was half an hour. Another thickness could be an hour, but they were very vague. So what he had, I think, was a 10-minute time pencil. So he arrives in Rastenburg in Hitler's headquarters. He's due to go and address a planning meeting with Hitler and 20 odd other senior officers. Just beforehand, he says, "Oh, I've got to go and change my shirt because it's a hot and sweaty day," and so on. Goes and changes his shirt in an office. And he's in the process of fusing this time pencil, which he incidentally, he insists on doing himself. Even though he's only got 3 fingers on one hand, he's got a thumb and an index finger and a middle finger on his left hand. That's all he's got. His right hand has gone, and the ring finger and the little finger on the left hand have also gone from his injuries. So you can imagine he's quite clumsy in, operating a pair of pliers, for example. So, had this sort of specially bent pair of pliers that he used. But he insisted on doing it himself. His adjutant was with him, who had a full set of fingers and thumbs, but he insisted on doing it himself because he was sort of taking ownership of the act, right? That took time. Obviously, it was a stressful moment. Then, one of Hitler's adjutants bangs on the door and says, the Führer's waiting, sort of thing. So it's a stressful moment. And the key problem here is that Stauffenberg forgets to put the second charge in his briefcase. One charge is put in there with the time pencil set. Had he put the second charge in, it probably would have killed pretty much everyone in the room. But in the stress of the moment, he doesn't do it.
Was he in the room with the adjutant when he was doing it?
Yes.
So it's fair to say both of them screwed up, because the adjutant could have said, "Where's your second charge?"
Yes. And I think in the stress of the moment, I mean, they are officers of Hitler's army. Within 10 minutes, potentially, they are about to kill Hitler, and they are potentially themselves about to die. So I think you can forgive them the fact that they're a bit stressed.
Yeah, I'm sitting in a really comfy chair.
Exactly. I think we can forgive them that they were stressed out. But yeah, that's exactly it. And yeah, so it's a failing of the adjutant as well. He could have just said, stick the other charge in there, and it would have been game over, I'm sure, because it would have been essentially twice the bomb that it otherwise would have been.
But it also would have been game over had the briefcase not been
moved.
Shifted. Yeah.
So the briefcase was moved, which is another thing. So Stauffenberg goes into the meeting, which is ongoing. Hitler had these sort of rolling meetings, and people come and go. It's a normal thing. So Stauffenberg comes in and he says, part of his shtick, he says that because of my injuries, I'm hard of hearing. Can you make sure I'm close to Hitler? Right? Yeah, of course. So they put him close to Hitler. He puts the bag down, and he puts it down on the inside edge of a big sort of slab leg of the table, oak slab leg of the table, big conference table, if you can imagine, with sort of slab legs. I always call them slab legs, but solid wooden legs. And he puts it down there. Of course, essentially, metaphorically speaking, the bomb is ticking. And then he says, "Oh, I've got to go and make a phone call." He disappears again. Again, it wasn't unusual. People did that. So he disappears again. And then everyone sort of moves around to look at the maps on the table or whatever it is. And one of those present, Colonel Brandt, supposedly kicks Stauffenberg's briefcase, and reaches down and moves it to the other side of the slab leg, right? Because it's in the way. When it goes off, 3 people are killed the same afternoon, essentially that moment, and they're all on that side of the table. Okay? The 4th person dies about 3 months later, but 3 people are killed that afternoon, and they're all on that side of the table. So that shows you that actually 2 things: the moving of the bag was crucial, was decisive, and also the fact that the bomb was half the bomb it should have been is decisive. If you change either of those, or ideally both of those, again, Hitler is probably toast.
And the problem with Hitler surviving these various attempts is he thinks that God is, or there's some higher power protecting
Yeah.
him.
Yeah, so Hitler had this weird, he used to talk about providence. He was a lapsed Catholic, obviously, so he wasn't really religious, but he used to talk about what he called providence, which was, sort of a vague deity or a higher power or whatever it is, whatever it was in his head. And every time, I mean, he didn't know about a lot of these. So, for example, when Henning von Tresckow keeps trying to kill him, which he does, Henning von Tresckow makes 4, if not 5 attempts on Hitler's life, 5 plots on Hitler's life. And one of these is a bomb in Hitler's plane, which fails to go off. So Hitler never knows about it. But the ones that Hitler knows about, for example, Georg Elser, or then later Stauffenberg, when he does know about them, he interprets his own survival, as a sign from on high that he's being preserved for great things. And if anything, it makes him more radical and more determined than he was before. So it certainly doesn't act as a brake on his ambition.
Now, the Stauffenberg failed plot results in a vast number of executions, doesn't it? With
Yeah.
particularly horrible ends, people being hanged with piano wire.
Yeah. So there's a sort of roundup. As I said before, crucially, the Stauffenberg plot, couldn't just be an assassination. It had to be a wider attempt at a coup d'etat. So that, by its very nature, implicated a lot more military men, a lot more politicians, and so on. So there's basically a sort of a sweep, a dragnet carried out by the Gestapo of all of those, circles that were sort of exposed, and they would basically drag people in. As you can imagine, they would drag people in, and under interrogation, they'd be beaten up, and they'd say, right, who did you speak to? Who do you know? Who else knows about this? And then they drag all those people in and do the same thing. They dragged in all of their families and did the same thing. I mean, it's absolutely brutal. And in the process, the net is thrown ever wider. In the end, about 6,000 people are arrested and interrogated, and the vast majority of those are executed. So anyone even vaguely close to this is basically, there's kind of no grey areas.
Perhaps
So,
the most prominent military person who's picked up, or at least is threatened, I think he kills himself, is Rommel.
yeah, I mean, there are many more, of course, but Rommel's one of those, because I suppose because of North Africa and his the perception of him, I'll be quite careful with my words, the perception of him as being a decent fellow. Rommel sort of has a place in sort of Western historiography almost as one of the good guys. I would question that, but anyway, that's how it is. And he was implicated. Supposedly he was in some of the the planning documents of the wider resistance as to someone who might lead the army in the event of in the event of a successful coup. He was someone they thought might be on side, and probably because he'd probably expressed doubts and concerns about the leadership of the war and Hitler's leadership to somebody in one of those circles. That was enough for him. When the dragnet gets to him, he's visited by a couple of senior officers. I can't remember who they actually were, and they basically say, "Well, you're going to have to go to court for all that. You're going to be tried for all of this because you're complicit." And that's going to be very embarrassing, and it's going to be embarrassing for your wife and your family, and it's going to end your career. Or you could just, do the decent thing. And of course, he does the decent thing, kills himself. So the extent of Rommel's kind of participation in inverted commas is very much disputed. But there are others who are, there are other senior military men, General Beck, for example. I mean, all of these very senior figures. A lot of, General Fromm is another one who we talk about tomorrow. So a lot of military figures are executed, and the wider political conspiracy as well is completely unraveled. So, and then you see in that last, what is it, 8 months or so of the Third Reich, you can see, if anything, there's a radicalization, if that's possible. So that they don't trust the army anymore. So there's a ramping up of the sort of political control of the army. There's a ramping up of mobilizing the population. Things like the Volkssturm, like the almost comparable to Dad's army sort of thing, but except these guys are old men who are sent into battle against the Soviets, right? So there's a ramping up of the sort of control and mobilization of society in the aftermath. So again, like Hitler, it doesn't temper events; it makes them accelerate.
Okay, Roger. So, final question: if this book were to be given a new edition, and your editor said, right, we're going to have another, do you want to add anything to it, take anything out? What would you change to a new edition?
That's a good question, Ollie, and it's not one I've ever been asked, I have to say. And I have thought about this, particularly with this book, because at the time, I included Albert Speer as the last chapter. And Albert Speer is a really interesting case because he was a slippery bastard, is the only way we can describe him, and very much wrote his own narrative post-war. And where I was when I wrote this, which is now, believe it or not, 20 years ago, I was probably more willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on this issue, at least, than I am today. I think there's still question marks there. I think, he obviously had, you'll see, if you read the chapter, it's still an interesting, I'm not saying that it needs to be necessarily disregarded or not read, because I think it's very interesting. He certainly does have some sort of nervous collapse in 1944, partly pressure of work and partly, he was an intelligent man. He could, the eyes open, he could see where Germany was headed. And in the aftermath of coming back from that collapse, I think he started to ask some serious questions. So he does seem to, in many ways, he countermands, for example, Hitler's Nero order in March of 45, which was basically to destroy, pretty much everything. We're going to destroy everything as, if we're going down, Germany's going down. Destroy infrastructure, destroy, factories and so on. And Speer, I think it's incontrovertible that Speer does a lot to countermand that, regardless of how slippery he was. So I think there's elements there where he obviously was thinking twice about what was going on in a genuine sense. Now, whether that leads him to some sort of half-hearted plot, I would question more now than I did 20 years ago. So I'm not throwing it out entirely, but I would probably want to at least rewrite that chapter. That would be my answer. But I still think it's a fascinating episode. It's worth having a look at.
Well, each plot is fascinating. So, listeners, you know what to do. Links are in the show notes.
Saturday.
Roger back on.
Yes.
Talk about the Tom Cruise vehicle that is Valkyrie.
Indeed. All the fun of the fair. Yes, I mean it's very much a Valkyrie weekend, isn't it?
Ollie? Indeed. And thanks very much, Roger. I think that we'll be talking about another plot for our film club in August, which will be the plot to kill Heydrich.
Yes, indeed. Look forward to that.
We very much enjoy discussing killing or attempting to kill Nazis on this podcast.
Wonderful stuff.
Thanks,
Roger.
Roger.
Thank you very much, Ollie. All the best.
Thank you very much for listening. Links are in the show notes. And don't forget, part 2 is out on Saturday with Roger and Tim discussing Valkyrie, starring Tom Cruise as von Stauffenberg. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.